Hello everyone. This presentation will show you some of the different methods of research that sociologists prefer to use. So as we go through this, be sure that you're filling out your note sheet that is within our Google Classroom folder. So the first step is defining the problem. What do we hope to study? And often this is looked at through a variety of different concrete terms known as operational definitions. These are the kinds of things that we need to make sure we identify, that we clarify within the experiment so that we know exactly what it is that we're looking for. And then if someone else were to come and do the same experiment as we are doing, they know exactly the kinds of things that we want to look for so they can replicate it for validity purposes. And as we go through this, a lot of this stuff is going to sound very similar to psychology if you've taken psychology, and that's because it is. Sociologists and psychologists go about things in very similar ways when it comes to research, with slight variations that you'll see along the way. So the first step is defining the problem. The next is to review the literature. So before you can go and do your own experiment, it's probably a good idea to see what else is already out there. Who is carrying out research? How credible are they? What do they find? Because if someone's already done the same experiment that you want to do, you can use theirs and alter it, or simply just use theirs within the greater context of your experiment overall and your hypothesis, and what kind of other associated information is available for you to have, because that's the kind of thing that you want to check out before you do your experiment to save you time. So the first step is defining the problem. The second step is reviewing the literature. The next is you actually want to formulate your hypothesis. So what do you expect to find? And I know the idea of the hypothesis is not something that's very new for a lot of you guys. I think throughout middle school and high school, you've had different experiences using them, especially in science. But in sociology, it's also used. And again, you're making a prediction about the relationship between two variables. So there's correlation, which is some sort of shared relationship. Something relates to something in another way, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there's causality. Meaning, causality is when a change in one is going to change another. So the independent variable makes a change, the dependent variable follows suit. Just because something is correlated, meaning that they have a relationship, doesn't necessarily mean that one is going to cause another, meaning one change in one is going to cause a change in the other. And so that's something that you definitely want to make sure that you pay attention to, is that just because it has correlation, it does not mean that there's also going to be causality as well. And these are the kinds of things that you think about as you formulate a hypothesis. The next one is then you want to go ahead and carry out your research design. What kind of data do you want to find? Where are you going to gather this data? How can you best gather this data? You got to start to explore different kinds of research options for you, which we'll go through in just a few minutes, looking at which one might be the best. So what kind of data do you want? How are you going to find it? And what's the best way of finding that data? So what type of data is gathered? You have two options. One is quantitative and the other one is qualitative. I'm sure at some point in your lives in school you've heard these two terms before. Quantitative is the actual numerical data, the actual things that you're finding, the actual numbers, the hard data that you are looking for, using questionnaires, equipment, collecting data. Researcher knows exactly what they're looking for. You analyze this data, and you want to classify, you want to count, you want to organize, you want to construct some sort of models of data, some graphs, some charts, something like that. That's the point. It's very objective, meaning there's a precise measurement, there's no room for interpretation, the numbers are exactly as they are, and they're to be interpreted as such. On the other side, you have qualitative data. This is the kinds of things that you develop as a result of this quantitative data. You have detailed descriptions. You have different ideas that aren't necessarily so black or white. This is more of that gray area. The researcher is really this tool for gathering the data. It's very subjective, meaning the interpretation of the data is really up to the person themselves. So once you have data, the researcher then will say, all right, well, I guess this is telling me this, or I think this is trying to show this based on my hypothesis. That is the qualitative data. And typically, this is done more so prior to the data. So as I mentioned before, it might be something that's done after. It's really heavily used beforehand as you're starting to make your hypothesis and think about things, but it can also be used a little bit toward once you have some quantitative data towards the end of your research. So primarily, you're going to see this one happening first, followed by this one. So where are you going to get all this data from? A population, which is the entire group of who you're going to study. A sample is drawn, so you take a small amount of people from this population, and you can divide them up into an experimental group, into a control group, depending on what you want to do. There's a variety of different measures and designs that you can use to gather data scientifically. Each one comes with their own advantages and disadvantages, so you just want to make sure that as you conduct a research experiment that you pay attention to not only the focus of of the data you're trying to get, but also what those advantages and disadvantages are to better help you decide. So there's naturalistic observation. This is where you just simply watch and observe the subjects in their natural habitats. You do not interfere at all. Think of this like a zoologist studying different animal behaviors in a zoo, or a researcher out in the wild watching animals behave. You don't interact, you don't talk, you don't say anything, you simply watch and observe and take note of what's going on. Participant observation, some sociologists can actually join in with the group for a period of time in order to get a sense of how things operate. You can interview. This one's pretty straightforward. You ask the individual subjects some variety of different questions, typically open-ended questions, to gather a variety of different ideas to allow them to really get to the heart of what you're trying to get at. You can use a case study, or what's also known as an ethnography. And this involves more of a in-depth longitudinal, meaning for a longer period of time study of usually one group or one person within a society. And this allows us then, if we can study this one group or person or society, to allow us to make larger inferences about the world overall, about if this is how one society operates within these variables, it's most likely the case for the rest of the world as well. Content analysis, where you have some sort of artifact of some sort that you analyze and look for symbols and create some data from there. A survey, another one that I'm sure you're very familiar with. In fact, the survey I asked you to fill out earlier on this week. So this involves a lot of different questions. Again, these are typically close-ended, so you're looking for one answer or the other. But again, you're asking people the same on people, same questions to gather some data about them. Secondary data analysis. This is when you take a researcher's, so this is part of that step 2, but the research literature that's already out there. You take what's already out there and you conduct secondary analysis. You analyze that data again, combining some of your own thinking, combining some of their thinking together. And it can mean redoing the study from previous generations or older studies to be able to find things out. And this is done a lot. A lot of researchers like to do a lot of secondary data analysis, especially if that data comes from many years before. Experiments, as we talked about before, you manipulate the independent variable to identify what kind of effect it's going to have on the dependent variable. So this is when you want to test your specific hypothesis. And this really isn't so much used within sociology. Typically, you're going to see some of those other options we've talked about. This experiment is typically more seen for psychology. You use it a lot with variables for psychology. Sociologists are really going to look more of naturalistic observation, interviews, that kind of thing, where they can interact with people versus just identifying variables. Now, just like psychology, there's certain research ethics and guidelines that sociologists have to follow. And these are fairly new, especially within psychology, because for a long time, we didn't see these things happening. If you have studied psychology, you know anything about Milgram and the shock experiments. These are the kinds of things that were happening in the 60s and 70s that only into the late 80s, 90s, and even the 2000s do we see guidelines for. So there's 3 real major components to research ethics. 1, you do not do any kind of harm, physical, psychological, otherwise. No harm can be done. You need informed consent. The participants need to be fully aware of any risks that could occur or that they can be exposed to within the process of the research. And they have to consent to that, saying, yes, I understand the risks and I'm okay doing this experiment or doing this, or conducting this research, I should say. And there's also what's known as voluntary participation. You cannot force any participants to join in the experiment. They need to be aware that they are being researched, and that, of course, that there's an assumption of privacy, that people can be watching in a public place, that this is fine, and that all their information will be protected. And of course, the last step then is drawing conclusions. What does this data tell us? What does it mean? Does it help my hypothesis? Does it support it? Does it refute it? How can we explain what we see? Can we apply this to other situations? And what might now be the next step for research? So I know I went through this fairly quickly, but it's a video, so feel free to go back and watch it and pause at different points. If you have any questions, make sure to fill out the interactive guide, and I'll be sure to address those first thing tomorrow. But otherwise, hope you enjoy the video, and I will see all of you tomorrow. Take care.